This is how I think you should get started in Blender. All you need to keep in mind is that Blender is a tool. As much as you can follow tutorials and do specific things to get specific results, the best thing to do is to learn the tool itself so that way you can learn how to make anything that you would like. For probably a decade, I never really got into Blender because I never found the right tutorial for me until I realized that it's pretty much as simple as learning the basic tools and how they work. Once I learned that, it was much easier to take pretty much anything and make anything I want from it. The first most important thing, in my opinion, is probably navigation. This is navigating around Blender, mainly in the viewport. So for example, the two most important tools you'll have are panning and rotating the viewport. To rotate, you can just use the middle mouse button, drag around. To pan, you're going to do Shift middle mouse button, though you'll see I personally remapped it to spacebar. A combination of both of these tools allows you to very easily get around. The next most important tools, in my opinion, are the focusing tools. So for example, if I do Alt middle click on an object, I can specifically go to that part of the object. This allows you to center your focus around that part, and it's a lot easier. Rather than being all the way over here and trying to line up, you can just click, and there you go. The other one similar to this is numpad period. So if you select an object and then do numpad period, it'll center you around the origin of the object. I think these controls are essential for you to visualize things in 3D and get your way around your objects that you're trying to work on. Now I'm just going to go into a bunch of general tools that I think are really important for actually working on models. Of course, you have G to translate. We need to move things around. By default, it does it on the view plane. So wherever you're facing, it will go. So if I pull it over here, you'll see it kind of just followed that general path. If I do the same thing here, you can see it went like this way. The other thing you can do with G is pull things along a specific axis. So for example, if I do GY, you'll see that there's a green line that pops up and I can pull it just along that axis. Same thing if I do it with X or if I do it with Z. Also, if you do Shift and then one of those axes, it will exclude it. So for example, if I do Shift X, it will exclude the X axis, but allow me to move on the Y and Z. If I do Shift Z, it only does it on the floor. And then same thing with Y. You can see it. You can pretty much do the same thing with rotate. So R, it'll rotate around your current viewpoint. You can also rotate along the axes. You can also technically rotate excluding the axes, but I don't really see why you would do that. You would just do the normal one anyway. To summarize so far, you know how to pan around and rotate. You know how to focus on an object. You know how to translate an object in space. And you know how to rotate an object in space. These are the tools that you're going to spend a lot of time using, so these are pretty much essential to your Blender experience and for you to visualize what you're working on. One other location-based thing that is nice is, say that I move an object away from the origin, this little red and white circle. I can do Shift S, and I get a ton of options here for how I want to move things. So for example, if I want to move the object back to the cursor, I can do Selection to Cursor. In the event that the world origin is not at the center, so for example, if I do Shift right-click and it's moved to a different point, I can do Shift S, Cursor to World Origin. And then if the object is offset, it'll now go back to the origin. If you offset the cursor and then do Selection to Cursor, it'll move to that point. Relative to the cursor and all the movement things we did, there are some buttons up here at the top that you can see. The main one I'm going to focus on is Transform Pivot Point. This allows you to change the point around where things move. So for example, if I select 3D Cursor, and then I move the cursor here, you can see that it will rotate around that cursor. This is incredibly useful if you want to, for example, rotate a door on its hinge. There's also a myriad of other ways that you can just utilize this cursor, and it's really useful. I'll quickly go over the other pivot points. The default bounding box center just finds the center point of all of the objects that you have selected and it will rotate around them. 3D cursor again does it around the 3D cursor. Individual origins allows you to rotate things based on their own origin, like this. Median point is similar to bounding box center, though it's a little bit different sometimes depending on how you have things selected. And then active element does it around the active element. So you see how this is a light yellow and this one's an orange. Yellow is active and orange is selected. So the yellow one on the left is the active one. These pivot points are really good when you're doing a little bit more complex movements or anything when you're modeling. So to recap again, you know how to translate objects, rotate objects, move around the viewport, focus on things, and now you know how to rotate things in more complex ways. And you know how to use the pivot point to your advantage. Those are pretty much the core things you need to place objects, move them around, and kind of visualize your 3D scene. And those are like the fundamentals of using Blender. And now that you have these pieces, it should be pretty easy to move on to other things. From here on out, I'm just going to list a bunch of random tools that I think are pretty useful that have helped me that I didn't know about before. Just a warning, I'm about to get very rambly because I'm just going to throw a bunch of random stuff I know at you in no particular order. So of course you have things like bevel where you can do Control B and pull things out. You can also use your mouse wheel to change how many edges there are. However, one of the biggest modeling tools you will use are loops, anything related to loops. A loop is basically just a bunch of edges that form a continuous loop around an object. So for example, if I turn on X-ray mode, you can see that this is a loop since it goes all the way around. I can do Alt-click to select a loop. Though, for example, on the top edge of this cube, it's not a loop technically. This is why quads are really important. Quads are a face where it has 4 sides because it allows you to do, for example, Control R to do a loop cut, and you can use the scroll wheel to add more loop cuts. This is generally useful if you need to do more complex movements. You'll eventually figure out how it's used. This is a bit of a crude example, but if I want to fold out this box accordion style, I can set the cursor here, select one of the loops, and then do this. Though specifically, you'll probably notice that there is this circle where if I scroll, it changes the area of influence. What this is proportional editing. Proportional editing is great because it allows you to change things based on a radius. So if I translate this, you can see how it's changing. If I bring the area of effect down, it doesn't affect as much. There are different places this tool can be used, but you can probably find the places that it will be used. Proportional editing is mainly changed by this curve. Once you start to use these, you'll understand kind of how they work. I would definitely suggest just making, like, for example, a large object with a lot of loop cuts. So like if I do this and then turn off X-ray, and if I select a vertice and do proportional editing on it, you can see how it's affected. So that's sharp. You can see how it has a sharp fall off. This is actually a perfect example. You can see how it's just sharp. If I do smooth, which is default, you can see how it like rounds out. So if I do that on the Y, like this, you can see the same thing. And then all the other ones are pretty similar. Constant is constant. It's just going to move all of the ones within the circle at the same amount. Linear is linear. You can see how it's very straight here, though as it tapers off, it is affected slightly differently. Sphere is a sphere, and you kind of get the idea. This is a bit more of a complex thing, but this is exactly why I say you kind of want to learn the tools, right? Because now you kind of know how this works. So you might find chances of, oh, I'm working on a model in a certain way, and maybe I can use this tool to do that. That's why the undo button exists, right? Or if you want, you can duplicate a collection to do backups. You can literally back up your blend file and you can just test things out, right? You can try things like, oh, this is interesting, right? I like the way this looks. So that's kind of why I'm showing you not how to specifically do something, but how the tools work, because you will find places where these tools will come in handy. Another tool that's pretty great and universal is the magnet tool up here, or snap. This allows you to snap your selection to other things. So for example, by default, it's incrementing. So if I do magnet and I do increment, you can see it's going to snap to the grid. The default grid size is this, like as shown by this grid here on the floor. There is a way to change the size of that, but I can't remember exactly. And there's not really a lot of use cases where you would do that. But for example, if I do vertex and I turn off proportional editing, you can see that when I do G and I just do this, it will snap to any vertice that I hover. So like, for example, if I want to also snap this box to this vertex on the edge, I can do that. So you can see it's kind of weird. In this case, there are different ways that you can snap. So for example, this snap is closest. I don't know exactly in this case what it snapped to, but if I were to change that to center, it should snap to the origin point like this. If I turn on X-ray, you can see exactly what I mean. You can see the origin, this little yellow dot, has snapped exactly to that vertice. There's a bunch of other options here. So for example, edge. So if I do G and then edge, you can see it's snapping to that edge of the box. And you can see how I rotated here to get a better visualization of what's happening. This allows me to understand how it's moving, right? There's also a face project, which is nice because it does it against the face. This is pretty good. So like if you have like furniture or something and you want to snap it to the floor, where the origin point is probably at the bottom. There's also face nearest. I never really used this one personally, so I don't really know how it works. Oh, I see. So it's just automatically finding the closest face no matter where I put my cursor. That's cool. Volume, I guess it's just snapping to anything that's inside of the object. Yeah, it seems about right. Edge center is pretty useful. It's the same kind of concept as vertice and edge, but it does the centers of the edges. That's pretty useful sometimes when you need to center things like against the wall or anything else, right? I've never done edge perpendicular. I don't know how that works. Never really used it. I've also never really gone outside of closest or center, though that's kind of like, again, understanding the tool, right? So like closest, that usually grabs the closest like vertex usually. So you can see here, it grabbed this corner. So if I pull it down here and then do it, it'll try to snap to like here or any of these. That's kind of how closest works. But now that you have the context of some of this, you can play with that tool and learn how it works. That's kind of the theme of this, is you should be curious about the tools and how they work. And you should go into sandboxes like this and just kind of just mess around with the tools, right? Like learn how they work and how they can be useful to you. That's kind of the theme of Blender. But now we've done a lot. You can now magnet things to other objects. You can use proportional editing to change objects dynamically like this or in certain ways. You know how to use the pivot point into your advantage in case you need to rotate certain objects a certain amount or anything. And you know how to move around and visualize things, right? Another cool tool is the Extrude tool. E allows you to extrude. By default, it does it whichever way the face is pointing. Another thing to note is that if you do extrude, if you press escape, it doesn't actually delete the face. If I press G here, you can see it still exists. So you have to like undo again, and so that way it actually gets rid of the face. But now you can see if I do extrude, it kind of just takes that face and does that. It kind of automatically calculates how to deal with it. So you can see if I just keep doing this here, right, I just get these little cutouts that kind of handle themselves. That's the other thing when you're doing a lot of modeling like this. It's usually better to stay with edges or faces. This allows you to conform to the geometry more. Because for example, if I like select an edge and then extrude it, this is kind of gross. But what I mean by that is like, you can't really do anything with this and it just causes problems down the line. So like, for example, another cool tool, if I select two edges and do F, it fills the space and does like a face. This also works if you, for example, if I get rid of all of these faces, I can select an edge, and because these lines are continuous and have vertices at each point, if I just press F, you can see it fills in. But anyway, this is strange geometry and it doesn't really make sense to do this, right? So you kind of want to be careful about using the extrude tool or duplicating, for example. So if I do Shift D, I can duplicate vertices or whatever. That same concept works for the actual objects. You can duplicate objects like that. There's also Alt D to do a link. Links allow it to share data, but that's a little bit more advanced. But it is good for large scenes where you maybe have a ton of stuff. If you can't tell already, I kind of tangent a lot, which is why this is a separate thing. But, you know, having weird geometry like this, it's best to avoid it because you're going to run into issues where you might have overlapping vertices or overlapping other things, right? So like, for example, if I were to duplicate this face and then press escape so it goes back to its original position, I now have overlapping faces, right? So like if I go to like, oh, you can also see how it's like visibly different. There's a black border here, though it's hard to see that sometimes. One way you can get around this is generally if you select all and do M to merge and by distance, it finds the closest vertices and deals with that. So for example, you saw down here, it said removed 4 vertices. So now if I go here, this should be correct. Also, don't be worried about picking up all these at once. You're not going to get it at first try and you're going to learn through practice, right? And that's kind of why, again, I suggest going into a sandbox and just messing around with stuff so you can get familiar with the tools. Don't worry about doing a donut. For example, I have never done the donut tutorial. Like I've tried it once and I've gotten kind of far with it, but I ultimately learned best by just playing around with the tools and being curious, finding random YouTube videos that kind of go over the tools. Finding like if I get caught up on a certain piece and like I don't know how to do it, I'll try to search for what I'm trying to do, and sometimes I will find a tool or whatever inside Blender that helps me achieve that. I guess I didn't even cover how to add objects. So if I were to reset my world origin and hide all of these, maybe make a new collection. If I do Shift A, I can add all sorts of different objects. You can also add Susan, of course. I'm kind of sad that they changed it. It says monkey instead of Susan now. It's really sad, but that's fine. Also, if you hold Z, you can change the view type, just like over here on the top right where you have these 4 buttons. You have wireframe, solid, material, and rendered. But yeah, so Shift A, you can add different types of things, curves, whatever. Usually you're just going to be dealing with default objects and going from there. So as an example, let's say that maybe I want to create a room for a game. There's a couple ways I can go about this. One way a lot of people might do is they might take a plane and be like, oh, I want it to be like this, right? One other thing you need to know, Control A, rotation and scale. If you look over here on item, you can see the scale I changed. It's 2.5. I do Control A, rotation and scale. It sets this to 1. This is important just because if you try to do different like transformations on the object, or related to the object, especially if you like export it to Unity or something, it will cause problems. So generally you want to get in the habit of Control A, rotation, scale on your objects. But anyway, back to the point. A lot of people might, for example, take this and be like, well, okay, I want walls, right? How do I do that? Maybe I can select this edge and extrude it up and then on the Z so it's, equal. And then maybe I want to do this, right? Oh, Y, get it close-ish, I guess. Whatever, right? Oh yeah, I've made a room, but what you did there is you've made a really weird object that kind of does this. None of the things are connected, and this has a lot of inherent problems that over time, as you get used to it, you'll learn where those problems are. Like if you have it overlap like this, when you go to bake something in Unity, it might cause problems. If things aren't connected, you might get weird artifacting at the edges, all those sorts of stuff. So for example, instead of doing this, if I want to make a room, I can actually just add a cube if I go out of edit mode, by the way, tab is edit mode if you couldn't tell. Cube, GZ1, that allows me to move it up. And then if I select the face, I can move the faces by themselves. Cool, there we go. We have a room. Also, one thing you might want to do is if you go to edit, preferences, add-ons, search for meta. Is it? No, it's not meta. Rigify? Yeah, Rigify. Enable Rigify because then you can shift A, armature human meta rig. And now you have a 2 meter tall, 2 meters a little tall, so you could probably like shrink him a little bit. Whoops. Now we have a reference human. So like, oh, instead of the room being like, oh, this room looks right. No, it's not. It's huge. I can just not do that, right? So now I can reference everything. Though you might notice if you bring this into a game engine, if you're inside of the cube, the faces will probably look like this. So how do you solve this? If you go to the overlay dropdown here and you select face orientation, I'm just gonna turn this off. You can see it's red. Red's not good. Well, red is the back side of the face. Blue is the front side of the face. Basically, it just means is when you bring into like a game engine, by default, the backs of the faces are cold. That's why it says backface culling here. The way to solve this is if you go into edit mode, select all the faces that you want to flip. In this case, I'm just going to press A because I need all of them to be flipped. Then do Alt N, and then you can see flip. I'm just going to press F, and now it's fixed. There's also another method. So if I do Shift N by default, I believe calculates outside. So if I go here, yeah, recalculate outside, Shift N, recalculate inside, Shift Control N. So if I do Shift Control N, it calculates inside, outside, right? So these shortcuts you'll kind of pick up. You don't have to worry about memorizing all the shortcuts. You'll just kind of pick up on them as you need them. It's just good to remember that these functions exist, right? You don't have to remember the hotkey, just that the function exists. So like if you need to figure out where it is, often I believe if you do F3, yeah, you can search. So like I can do recalculate inside, right? Okay, yeah, I need that. Or maybe I want to F3 extrude. If I were to select this face and do F3 extrude, extrude faces, right? Oh, look, it extruded, right? I wouldn't use F3 for everything, but if you're having trouble remembering, you can try to do that, right? So cool. Now I have like a little box with stuff, you know, well, no stuff yet, but it's a box with the inside, so I can see the inside, and I can bring this into a game engine. And like, if I wanted to add, once render starts, there we go. If I want to like add a light source, I can add a light source. By default, this is Eevee. So Eevee, if you see over here on the properties tab, render properties, render engine Eevee. Cycles is the one that is ray traced. You can see it's doing the ray tracing thing. Eevee is closer to a game engine. So it's a little bit better if you're trying to visualize stuff for a game, kind of. It's also just simple, so it's sometimes easier to understand your like models and stuff. Though you sometimes need to like add stuff. So like I'm going to add ambient occlusion. You can see it adds the edge stuff here. Bloom just kind of is nice. Screen space reflections is good. So like if I come down here and I bring this low, you can see there's no reflections here, but if I turn it on, okay, that didn't work as flawlessly as I thought it would, but you can see how it's like brightening. It's just, it's now calculating the reflections, right? You want that. And then there's another one here, shadows. Increase this to 4K. It doesn't really matter at high bit depth. Now the shadows will look good. So like if I add a cube here, maybe bring it small, you can see if I bring this down, the resolution of the shadow is not high. Same with that. But if I bring it up, it'll be nice and sharp. Cool. But like, let's say maybe I want to add a window, right? I can do, in edit mode, I can do 2 loop cuts. In this case, let's see what axis, it's not on the x-axis, it is on the y-axis. So I can scale this. Do note, if you go past a certain point, it goes negative, and you can see how it's like overlapping. Try not to do that. You can also see if I do this, it's going across the vertical axis of the screen. So it's going, if you look on the top left over here, You can see it goes negative. Just be careful with that. So I'm going to scale this until it's like a window size I want. And then same thing here. I'm going to do this and scale on the Z. The other thing about move, you can GZ, of course, but you can also double tap G and it stays within the bounds of the object. If you hold Alt, it allows you to go beyond the bounds of the object. This is mainly nice if you're like trying to stay within the context of your object without breaking stuff. So like you can just, like that. So if you do this, it'll have overlapping vertices. But if you wanted to do that, you can do M by distance, like we talked about before. So again, this is just another instance of if you learn how the objects work, you can figure out what to do, right? Cool. So now what I can do is I can select this face and I can delete it. And now we have a window to the outside world. Blender Kit's a cool plugin. The way plugins work in Blender, basically you download a zip file, you go into preferences, add-ons, install, and then you'll find where your zip is and you just click the zip and install add-on. So Blender Kit's really nice. It allows you to get free models, materials, whatever. So like if I go to HDRs and I just, let it default, maybe just do outdoor, you can see, let's see, this one's cool. Okay. Yeah, we have an HDR now. So if I like turn off this light, you can see the lighting is more colorful and different because it's pulling from the HDRI. One thing I haven't figured out with Eevee, there seems to just light up the entire world no matter what without concern for shadows. I don't know how to fix that. I haven't looked into it. I haven't cared. But in this case, maybe I want to go to cycles. You can see how the light spills in from the window. Looks cool. What else? You can also see like how there's a blue tint. And I believe that's because of this blue right here. So like this is another thing, like I can rotate around the viewport and understand, oh, it's interesting that it's blue here. I look down because that's where the light is coming from, right? And be like, oh, that's blue. Yep. And now I understand the world around me. I know that sounds very weird, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. The core point of Blender is learning the tools and how to visualize and understand your scene, right? But that's the core of using Blender, is understanding what you're working with, getting used to like moving things around in a certain way. I want to hold, it's usually control, but it fucks up sometimes. Shift allows you to have more granular control. Usually control allows you to snap along the like increments of like the grid, but it doesn't do that sometimes. It's really strange. I don't know why. There's a ton of other things you can learn. Like for example, if I double this, it stays within the bounds of the object. Then I can like rotate this a certain number of times, and now I have a curved edge inside of my building. Oh, that's weird. It's very jagged. I want to right click, do shade auto smooth, so it's not as jagged. Oh, it's still jagged. Maybe I can go back and add more curves. Oh, it's still jagged because I undid shade auto smooth. Hey, look, that looks pretty. Things like that. If you do shade smooth, it'll average every edge, so it looks a little funky, right? Because it's doing every edge, trying to average them. You can see how it's like has a weird like box effect. If you do shade auto smooth, it sets the over here under object data properties, the normals auto smooth degrees. You can set that to whatever. Like if I go over, it's like this is a 90-degree edge, right? If I go over 90, you can see it smooths, right? Shade smooth just does like normal 180. Auto smooth sets it to 30 degrees by default. You can adjust this. So like you can see if I change it below whatever these are, it kind of just does that. And this is good for more complex objects where maybe you don't want to deal with manually setting all of the angles and stuff on your normals, and I've never even done that. It's really complicated. But yeah, like this is kind of the core fundamentals of modeling and stuff. And if you want to learn more complex stuff, I do have other things on my channel, like using curves to model and stuff like that. You can also probably check out any YouTube resource. If you just search for YouTube Blender or like whatever, you'll be fed a bunch of information about that. And a lot of the stuff I've learned about Blender is actually just casually watching YouTube. I'll get recommended videos about like, look at this cool new Blender feature or whatever, right? There's tons of great YouTubers that cover a ton of topics. I will link a few of them down below that I think are really good, that I love to watch quite often. But yeah, hopefully this video helped you in some way. I think that these are like mainly the beginning of the video, like understanding how to navigate the viewport and stuff is the most important thing, and everything else just kind of builds upon that, right? Modeling, moving things around, right? Once you get that down, you'll have something to work with. You'll be able to add stuff and do whatever. So yeah. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you would like to see other content like this. And you could probably check out these other videos to further your knowledge of Blender.